Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. When I bought my little farmhouse just outside the city limits, I thought I had found my own slice of paradise. The property had plenty of land, a cozy house, and best of all, no homeowners association, or so I thought. A few months after moving in, I got a notice in the mail saying a new homeowners association had formed. Apparently, my neighborhood had been annexed into an existing homeowners association from a nearby subdivision. I let out a frustrated sigh. So much for my peaceful country living. At first it didn't seem too bad. I paid the dues and figured that would be the end of it. The homeowners association board mostly kept to themselves, aside from sending the occasional letter about needing to pressure wash my siding or trim my bushes. Annoying but manageable. That all changed when I decided to build a barn. Now, when I say barn, don't go picturing some towering red wooden structure. I just wanted a simple little building to store my gardening tools and supplies. Nothing crazy. I submitted my plans to the city permit office, forked over my money for the application fee, and figured I was all set. I gathered my supplies and got to work erecting my modest little barn. Within a day, I had the frame up and was making good progress. Or so I thought, until I got a knock at my front door. I opened it to find Janice, the Homeowners Association president, standing there looking irritated. She demanded to know if I had approval from the Homeowners Association board to build a structure on my property. I politely explained it was just a small barn, no big deal, and I already got my permit from the city. Apparently that wasn't good enough for Janice. She insisted I was in violation of Homeowners Association bylaws regarding additions and construction. I asked her to point out exactly which bylaw prohibited building a barn. That's when she got a strange look on her face and said she would have to get back to me. A few days went by and I heard nothing from Janice or the Homeowners Association board. I figured they must have realized I wasn't breaking any actual rules. I finished up my barn and started putting it to use. Out of nowhere, Janice shows up at my house again, this time waving a piece of paper. She jabs her finger at some fine print mumbo-jumbo and declares that I'm violating Section 42.16 by having an unauthorized accessory structure on my property. I looked over the paper and saw that it was dated only a week ago, conveniently after I started building my barn. I told Janice in no uncertain terms that I would not be removing my perfectly acceptable barn just because she suddenly decided to add in some nonsense about accessory structures. Janice's face turned red with anger. She insisted the bylaws had been in place for years and I was blatantly defying the rules. I knew this was BS. I asked to see a copy of the original bylaws I'd agreed to when I bought the house 2 years ago. Not surprisingly, she hemmed and hawed about needing time to retrieve the documents from their legal archives. A few more contentious days passed before I got a letter from the Homeowners Association board claiming my barn was built too close to the property line and needed to be torn down. This time, they didn't even bother with the bylaws excuse. It was just a flat-out lie. My barn wasn't anywhere near the property line. They were simply making up infractions to get their way. By now, I was seeing red. These Homeowners Association despots thought they could bully me into submitting to their arbitrary demands. But if they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I drove straight to the permit office and requested an official copy of my approved application, along with the regulations I was required to comply with. As expected, there were no prohibitions on barns. The clerk even pulled the paperwork for my entire neighborhood to double-check. Nothing whatsoever about accessory structures or property setbacks that would impact my barn. Armed with my concrete proof that my barn did not violate any city or local codes, I sent a certified letter to the Homeowners Association board informing them that if I received any further harassment about removing my perfectly legal barn, I would be filing a lawsuit for harassment and racketeering. You're probably wondering why I jumped straight to accusations of racketeering against a group of nosy homeowners. See, I had recently learned that the president of our Homeowners Association board, Janice, also owned a construction company that specialized in, you guessed it, tearing down and removing unauthorized structures for homeowners associations. The conflict of interest was as clear as day. The implied threats of legal action seemed to work. I stopped hearing from the homeowners association about my barn after that. I also learned that at the next homeowners association board election, almost the entire board was replaced by new members. I made sure to submit a glowing recommendation for one of the candidates, along with a summary of the despotic barn debacle. In the end, I kept my barn and the homeowners association got a much-needed change in leadership. As for Janice and her cronies, let's just say their corruption caught up with them eventually. Last I heard, Janice's petty power tripping turned into felony charges of fraud and racketeering. I never did get to see the original bylaws, but my barn still stands proudly, with my garden tools and supplies tucked safely inside. My little farmhouse remains an oasis of peace and tranquility, no thanks to the homeowners association. I guess Paradise does have a few snakes you have to watch out for. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Background. This was back in the 1990s. I'd recently been medically retired from the military and was attending college in Texas. My wife was working in her chosen field while I did my level best to decide what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Anyway, one day I left the campus, going around the backside to avoid the traffic. I was heading over to pick up my wife for lunch and ended up sitting behind another car at a stop sign. The car in front of me was a brand new Chevy, one of their little sexy models, the actual trade name escapes me at the moment, in candy apple red, being driven by a fairly new blonde, also a little sexy model, whose name will also slip by unuttered. I sat, an old sailor in an old pickup, just listening to the radio and thinking about lunch, when the Chevy drove into the intersection and then stopped. I didn't think anything of it, so I hadn't done more than put my hand on the gear shift in preparation for pulling up when suddenly, with a suitable squeal of a tire, the Chevy shot back at me. I slapped the shift into reverse, but was too late. The little Chevy smashed into the front of my truck, doing around 25/30 miles per hour. After a second, I cut my engine, got out of the cab, and walked around to the front of my truck. The good news was that I could see that I wasn't going to have to worry about that loose belt squeal anymore. The bad news is that the front of my little pickup was pretty much totaled. The grill drove back into the radiator, water all over the pavement, headlights smashed. I bent down and noted that there seemed to be oil leaking as well. With a sigh of total incomprehension, I walked further up to the passenger door of the little red Chevy and its blonde driver. I was pissed, but not enraged. I guess I was still trying to figure out exactly what had happened and why she'd ended up stopping in mid-turn and put it in reverse like that. I looked through the tinted window, and she was on the phone, talking agitatedly to someone. With all the cell phone silliness I'd seen since leaving the military, seeing her yapping on one really didn't surprise me. Although, had I thought about it, I should have wondered who exactly she was calling. Instead, I tapped on the window, and she turned a bland face to me, then screamed into the phone, loud enough to penetrate the glass. "Oh my God, he's got a tire iron!" Naturally, I spun around and looked behind me. Then the nickel dropped. I turned in a slow circle and noted that there were no businesses, houses, or apartments in view. Nor was anyone on the sidewalks or walking down the roads. For that matter, the only traffic was several blocks away in any direction. Her little car was sitting at the stop sign, almost exactly where it had been when I pulled in behind her. I stepped back and looked at our vehicles. Yep, it looked for all the world as if I'd rear-ended her. Damn, the little idiot had set me up. I quickly walked back to my truck, thinking as fast as I could. Any minute now a police car was going to show up, called by the little blonde, expecting to find a crazed man with a tire iron, and I dearly needed to not be that man. I pulled my tire iron out from behind my seat and threw it as far as I could into the nearby field, then jumped into my truck. It was a slim chance, but it was the only hope I had. I made sure the truck was in reverse, then belted myself in, slammed my face into the steering wheel, opened my door, and heard sirens not too far away, and half slumped out the open door at an uncomfortable angle. I went limp just as the police car screeched to a halt. I ignored the policeman screaming at me to get out of the truck, trusting that my limp body would not move him to open fire. He finally edged his way over, noticed the bloody nose, tugged at an eyelid, I made sure my eye was well rolled up, and let me drop back into position. I stayed limp while he checked on the blonde, who was near hysterical with fright over the lunatic with the tire iron. Until she saw me, that is. I'd hoped that her rearview mirror was as off as it looked, or that she'd be too involved in concocting her own story to notice what I was doing. Upon seeing my body hanging limply below the driver's door of my truck, she stammered to a halt. A second set of sirens had been getting closer, and the policeman told the now silent blonde to stay in her car. A few seconds later, Someone cut me out of my seatbelt and laid me on the ground. A competent set of hands checked my vitals, and within a few seconds, a harsh and demanding smell flooded my clotting nose. I fought it for a few seconds and made a pretty good display of a man coming around after having been knocked out. I immediately made to throw myself to the side and stopped, half being restrained and half staring wildly around to see what had happened. The medic sat back when I sat up, looked at the front end of my truck and moaned, "What the fuck did that idiot do to my truck?" He told me to lie back down and started asking me professional questions about where I hurt and could I feel my toes and all that crap. Every few seconds I'd look back at the wreck and mutter about the idiot backing up like that and what the hell had he been smoking little bits of angry stuff. The policeman, having gotten the blonde statement, walked over and asked me if I felt up to talking. I said I felt fine, just a little sore. The medic okayed it and helped me to my feet. I gave the officer my license and proof of insurance and included my retired military ID card, then sat on my front seat and, as if I just noticed it, asked what had happened to my seatbelt. He explained that I had to be cut out of it, and I shrugged. Just another item for his insurance company to pay for. I guess what the hell was his story, officer? Why did he back up that way? The policeman looked sharply at me and asked me what I meant. I described exactly what had happened but concealed the fact that I knew it was a female driving the Chevy and kept referring to her as him. After I got done and he'd finished writing it all down, he asked if I had any proof. Proof? What do you mean, proof? I frowned at him, then let my jaw drop a bit. Hey, wait a minute. You ain't telling me that idiot is saying that I did this, are you? He admitted that the other driver's story was that I'd rear-ended her, not him, and then threatened her with a tire iron. I frowned again and informed him that I didn't have a tire iron, that it was sitting in the garage of my house a couple of hours away. I moved aside as he searched the cab of my truck and caught a lucky break when he noticed, without my having to point it out to him, that my truck was still in reverse. He got out of my cab, frowning, then asked me to stay where I was, and walked up to the Chevy. He then asked the blonde to step out of her car, and when she'd done so, leaned into the open driver's side door. After a few seconds, he stood back up and asked the girl to repeat her statement of what happened. It was a marvelously teary bit of acting, but she almost blew it by being somewhat puzzled when he didn't react. Instead, he asked her to go on and describe everything that had happened after the accident and everything she'd done then. She backed down from the tire iron story, saying that it might have simply been a reflection on her window, but insisting that I'd at least beaten on her window and that I'd simply been putting on an act for their benefit. The policeman looked over at the medic, who slowly shook his head. Years of doing search and rescue might not have done much good for me, physically, but I sure as hell know what an unconscious man acts like. The policeman then asked her if she'd tried to drive away or had she immediately shut off her engine. She said that the engine had died, and no matter what lies I'd said, that she'd never tried to leave the scene of the accident. The policeman nodded once and asked the medic to step over. He then asked the medic to sit in the Chevy and confirm that it was in reverse. I love smart people. I didn't even have to suggest he check. When I last saw the little blonde, she was honestly crying. She was also handcuffed and being driven away, arrested for making a false police report, some legal mumbo-jumbo about trying to run a con, and my favorite part, assault and battery. Once she'd realized that she'd blown it, about the same instant she was handcuffed, she started weeping and explaining that she didn't have the money for the payments on the car, and that her only option was to fake an accident, but that I'd been faking too and hadn't been injured. You gotta believe me. She wouldn't lie about that. I signed my name to an almost letter-perfect statement of events over at the police station, being careful to never mention in my statement about how my nose got banged up, or how I'd ended up unconscious and hanging out of the door. The arresting officer's report, as well as the EMT's, had already noted that it appeared that I'd either been partially ejected by the impact, or might have been trying to get out of the truck at the last moment. I've always believed that one should never sign one's name to a false statement. Wisest, in the long run, don't you think? Turned out that her car insurance was good, however, and they paid for my little pickup's repair. The damage wasn't as bad as it originally looked, thank God. A little front-end work, a new radiator, and assorted other dinged or dented gizmos, a little cosmetic surgery to make her outside look right once more. Hell, the mechanic is even going to toss in a full overhaul, including fixing that damn fan belt. I had to drive a loaner for the next week. also care of the blonde's insurance. And the irony of this will make you laugh. It was a little red Chevy. Nice car, and my wife and I had a ball riding in it, but way too expensive for a guy like me to drive every day. Hell, a car that nice might have made me try something stupid to make the payments. The next one is a petty revenge story. My sister, 35, and her new boyfriend, 30, who had been dating for a month before quarantine, are at my mom's, 55, house during the pandemic. My mom is getting pretty frustrated because her youngest, me, has left the nest, and she likes having the house to herself. My sister's boyfriend is gross. He doesn't wash his hands. He leaves mystery stains all over the carpets and floors. He has some sort of infection or open wound on his wrist that he doesn't cover or clean. He doesn't shower, and he doesn't clear his plates before putting them in the sink with no garbage disposal. Despite all of his hygiene issues, he'll still do things like reach into a new bag of bread my mom bought without washing his hands, even with the open wound. And he had just gotten back from the hospital for the third time in 2 days because of his wound. My mom's about to lose her mind being there with them. Regarding the dishes, he doesn't clear his dishes, and she has told them several times to clear off their plates or do their own dishes. He doesn't do either. After a week of these soggy noodles sitting in a bowl in the sink, my mom had had enough. His coat was sitting on a chair in the kitchen, so she took the ramen out of the bowl and stuck it in his coat pocket. Then she washed all of the dishes in the sink. He grabbed his coat a bit later to leave and go to a friend's house, to smoke pot with a bunch of friends during a pandemic, and she just smiled and waved him out the door. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Years ago, I was the systems supervisor at a university-based group. It was a joint venture with the administration board, and the budget came from university libraries around England and Wales. We operated a cutting-edge network connecting each of the university libraries. Our system managed book dispensing, receipts, and cataloging, which was quite complex. The catalog entry processing and various other batch processes ran automatically overnight. The system had to be operational by 8 a.m. when the libraries opened their doors. Before that could happen, we needed to take printouts from the overnight runs off the printer. We then had to go through the stack of line-printed paper logs to ensure no failures had occurred. Only then could the computer be rebooted into online mode for the libraries. Checking the stack of line-printed logs took about an hour. My routine was to arrive an hour early for work, review the printouts, restart the computer, and during that process, grab a cup of coffee. I would sit down to read the news headlines and enjoy my coffee, taking about a 10-minute break. Enter my boss, who, despite being an educated manager of a university group, had the personality of a mid-19th century mill owner. Rude, arrogant, and entitled were just a few words to describe him. We had clashed a few times before, but this incident was a real kicker. He walked in, saw me reading a newspaper and drinking coffee at 8:05 a.m., and without letting me explain, he gave me a stern talking to. He informed me that he didn't expect to see this behavior again. The next day, I arrived at work promptly at 8 a.m. I grabbed the pile of printouts and began working through them at a normal pace. There was no need to dawdle, as the libraries were already frustrated before I even began the checking process. However, instead of contacting us, they reached out to him at his home. He rushed in at 8:30, demanding to know why the computer wasn't up and available for the libraries yet. I explained that we needed to check the overnight logs for failures first, and this process took nearly an hour. He responded with, "We've been running on this machine for a year, so why hasn't this been a problem before?" I looked at him deadpan and replied, "Because until yesterday, I had been dedicating an unpaid hour of my time to ensure the computer was available to the libraries at 8 a.m. Since my efforts were not only ignored but also met with anger yesterday, I've decided to work strictly according to the rules from now on. The computer will not be restarted in online mode until these printouts are checked, and that won't begin until 8 a.m. He suggested that I could come in early myself and check them. I responded, "You won't be able to avoid a nationwide university workers' strike if you do that. Unions can be quite effective in certain situations." The standoff continued for the next 2 days, followed by the deputy approaching me. They invited me to a meeting with a group board member, an aged professor who had come to resolve the issue. The boss stepped away, the deputy, a much better person, was promoted, and I received a promotion along with a pay raise. I was also asked to change my start time to 7 a.m. This solved the problem, and everyone was content, including the board, who had their own problems with the now ex-boss, and were glad that I had provided them with the opportunity to remove him. The next one is an entitled people story. When my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer, she opted for no treatment. She had watched her husband go through chemo, radiation, and surgery, and he was miserable the whole time. She didn't want that for herself. Her family supported her. Over the next year, she gifted items to family and friends, telling us to write our names on the things we wanted, take what we wanted, etc. There were conditions. No, you can't have that. It's a family heirloom meant to go to Aunt and her kids, or to Dad and his kids. We all knew what those items were and who they were going to, so that was easily settled after she died. The house was inherited by my father, who very suddenly and unexpectedly passed away 2 weeks later. I inherited the house at that point. The next-door neighbor, we'll call him Todd, came over several times, upset that he and his kids, 21F 19M, weren't invited to Grandma's funeral. There wasn't one. We were all too busy reeling from my father's death. Weren't presented with a copy of the will, it only included family members. And he knew Grandma loved his kids like her own. She didn't. She complained about them coming over all the time, stealing her water to fill their pool, and she had to tell them to stop calling her Grandma. He wanted to know if I would allow his kids to go through the house to see if there was anything they'd like to take to remember her by. Okay, first dude, my grandma died 4 weeks ago, and dude, my dad died 2 weeks ago. I thought he was awfully rude, but I offered to let them go through the boxes I had packed that I was planning to donate, and he was offended. I mean, mortified! He said his daughter and son had their hearts set on some items that were family heirlooms, and I literally laughed at him. I explained they were family heirlooms and would be staying with me, and 2 of the items had already gone home with my brother. He said, my kids were her family and she would have gifted those to them. They should have been included along with everyone else when everything was divided up. Keep in mind that none of us knew this guy or his kids other than the neighbors next door. They were never at any family gatherings that were held at her house, and the only time I ever heard her talk about them was when she was complaining about them, especially when she caught them using both her hoses to fill up their pool and then came over complaining because she had put locks on the outdoor faucets. Luckily, Todd's house was in foreclosure and he moved away about a year later. I have more stories, but those will come later. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.